Good morning, Michelle. Hola.
Hola.
How is Spain today?
Yes, Spain is very nice today, thank you.
We, we all envy you your location, or some part of the audience, including myself. But good to see you again. And I'm happy to continue, in fact, continue our conversation that we started prior to the conference. So great to have you with us as a speaker and one of the leading voices on the subject of pay gap. Michelle, not sure if you managed to attend some of the yesterday's session as part of day one, but the conversation around pay equity was long and huge and just pretty much non-stopping. So I'm happy that we are following up on the subject, hearing your voice and giving you a spot. So I guess we can start with basics. And again, lots of conversation around the importance of trust and authenticity in the organizational culture as a trigger to further changes. So my question is around specific steps that you would recommend for organizations to take if they want to introduce pay equity or pay equity conversations. So let's start with looking into building trust and steps to achieve that.
Yeah. And I think it's a really good place to start because when we think about the conversation around money, it's quite an emotive one. And then if you add the fact that it's taking place within a workplace as well, that makes it kind of doubly emotive. And there is a real lack of trust. Like people don't feel safe having this conversation from an employee perspective. But also employers are probably not very used to holding this conversation because there's a lot of pay secrecy. So I think the first place to really start is to be honest about what your current situation is, because your employees are already living that reality. And I think it's important to be really honest, especially if there are improvements that need to be made around what the situation is and what it is that you hope to achieve going forward, whether you're doing pay audits or looking at pay gaps or trying to introduce pay transparency. And I think it's also really important not to make any assumptions around what your employees' expectations are going to be. So to really lead the conversation, you should be thinking about providing listening sessions or holding surveys or focus groups, because there are lots of different ways in which you can address pay conversations. But I think it's always helpful for employers to understand, well, where are their employees currently at? Like, what are the things that they would like to see improvements on? What are the things that you're already doing well? All of these things really help. And another big way to build trust is to decide, who the senior champions are going to be on this conversation, because we all know that nothing really gets done if there isn't that senior backing and that senior buy-in. So have them being very visible about championing what's coming, because that actually adds that credibility and trust in terms of the conversations that will be coming forward, changes that you're making around there's pay gaps, pay equity, or pay transparency.
So you mentioned the element of honesty, also identifying individuals, or let's call them voicers of the message in the organization. Having different channels to approach the conversations, that's one. But would you say that data, like just the solid data, also plays a role in having effective conversations around pay gap?
Yeah, most definitely. Because the role of data is to reveal disparities, isn't it? Or to identify trends or to highlight systemic issues. And if you are going to be making any form of change, you should be looking at what your data says. That's how business works, isn't it? You have your evidence and then you gather your insights from that evidence. And so always start with your data. But I think what's also important is to connect the data to your why. So how does doing regular pay audits or looking at pay gaps or improving your pay transparency, how does that connect to your organizational values? How does it connect to business outcomes? So things like talent retention or engagement or your business reputation, because it's all about linking those things, isn't it? So it's not a case of, well, we're just doing pay transparency because we've been told we have to. Link it back to, well, why is this important for the organization now? How is this going to benefit the organization? How is it going to benefit individuals? So it's really about humanizing the data that you have and providing some context to what the numbers are, is saying about you as an organization. And I think it's also really important to present that data in a really clear manner. So think about how you can make it visually appealing. How can you provide clarity for people who have questions around it? And then to draw on, well, how will you highlight the actions that you're taking based on the data that you have?
It's almost like communicating the whole process, not just a certain stage of the process or the journey, just to help people to grasp the broader picture from why to what, and including your personal why. And that I think leads us to the next question. About I think in a way, responsibility or accountability for communication. Once you send a message, once you verbalize a message, you as a leader take responsibility for what you communicate. So I wonder, how can leaders do it more effectively, in a more effective manner? I think recognizing the fact the conversation about money is pretty uncomfortable by default. Am I right? So how to do it effectively if it's automatically a bit uncomfortable?
Yeah, I think the key is to take a phased approach to it. And I see organizations that feel that they have to get everything right immediately. They have to dot all the I's and cross all the T's, and they have to be perfect in their execution and presentation of what it is that they're going to do. And invariably they get unstuck. And the reality is that, people want to see the approach. They want to see, well, what's the plan and the journey? And it doesn't have to be about that perfect execution. So the key here is to share what the roadmap is and to share what your short-term goals are as well as your long-term goals, and not to get hung up on doing things perfectly, and certainly not to get hung up on doing things because it seems like the right thing to do. So, for example, I know that there was a company that wanted to introduce pay transparency, and so the CEO decided that he would reveal his pay on Twitter, and then I think he revealed like some of the VP's pay as well, and it just went all horribly wrong, and then he ended up having to remove the tweet. That for me is an example of trying to basically overpromise when they hadn't done that kind of back end work around education and had taken that phased approach in terms of communicating the reason why they were doing this and not thinking about the impact. So I think that's really, really important. And also to be upfront about the challenges that you're going to face in taking this new approach, because you're essentially saying, well, how we did things in the past is not how we're going to be doing things going forward. So if you've never measured pay gaps before and you're going to start doing that, well, you have to anticipate, well, what are some of the issues and obstacles that we're going to come up against? And to be upfront about those challenges so that people understand, okay, this isn't going to be something that's solved in 2 seconds flat. There are going to be challenges. It may take longer than we want. We may make mistakes along the way, but having that communication upfront is really key so that you're not over-promising great results, but you're also not under-delivering, or at least having the perception that you're under-delivering because you're not talking about the things that you're learning and the challenges that you're facing.
Yeah, and I like what you're saying, and I think it's also kind of taking off some pressure off many shoulders. Don't try to be a perfect communicator, because we are not perfect communicators. Just be present and be the planner. And I think what you're pointing out as well is to ensure that the communication that you're sending to the organization, whether it's a high-level communication or individual that comes from the leader, should be predictive. You should plan it. You should predict things. Just don't be reactive. This is not the moment and not the context where you'd encourage spontaneity, right? Just
Yes.
plan in order to prevent, plan and predict. This is what I'm hearing from you. Michelle, a lot of questions also, as I'm seeing, we're getting from the audience around specific methods, specific approaches that companies that you work with and support made in order to introduce pay equity and maybe balance salary transparency. So what can you share has been working so far for companies?
Yeah, well, the thing in particular around pay transparency is that it is a spectrum. So there's no one hard and fast rule as to how you should do it. You can, there are different points at which you can decide as an organization, okay, well, point C is the point that we want to work to. So this is what we're going to do, while others will want complete and utter transparency. But some of the things that I have seen organizations do that really works is introduce like aggregated data sharing. So that might be simply introducing salary bands for the first time or salary ranges. Or if you are doing a pay audit, thinking of ways in which you can share that data and information in a way that is anonymized and protects people's identities, but you're sharing that this is what, the information is telling us about how things currently work within the organization. Another way you could do that is to focus on sharing role specific insights. So again, if you're doing equity audits, you can focus on specific teams or departments and aggregate that data down. But obviously, bearing in mind that you have to think about, GDPR, you have to think about people's privacy. So it's about finding ways to share enough information so that your employees understand what's happening within the organization, but not too much so it's, things are identifiable. Other things that you could do is around simply talking about your pay philosophy. So this is all about sharing and showcasing how pay decisions are made. So how is salary decided, how bonuses decided, how are promotions decided. So many organizations that I speak to, this is something that employees talk about, that they really feel left in the dark around how this works. And so they will start looking for other organizations who are much more upfront and vocal about that.
Yeah.
So these are some of the ways in which you can start to share some of those things so that you are constantly in communication with your employees as to how, what your commitment looks like.
Okay. So, considering that these conversations have been taking place, we are planning, predicting, and we are less reactive. How to make sure that these changes that we made today are sustainable and they lead to long-lasting pay equity?
The key is to make sure that it is embedded. The key mistake I see organizations making is that thinking that anything to do with pay is an isolated thing that happens over here while the business is over here. It has to be embedded within your business operations, and you should really be embedding it within your DEI strategies as well. Because the reality is that the outcomes from your pay gap problems, pay issue, pay transparency, they are already in the organization, but they're not being acknowledged and they're not being measured. So you should be thinking about your recruitment from a pay equity lens. What does promotion pay gaps look like in your organization? What does career progression pay gaps look like in your organization? How is pay equity exacerbated during performance reviews? So if you can embed it into those operational processes, it improves the likelihood of success because it's attached to something. And it's also really important to make sure that you have great levels of accountability as well. So who is going to be responsible for ensuring that at all of these touch points, pay equity, pay gaps, pay transparency is being considered? And again, making that very visible so that everybody knows this is the group of people that's responsible, this is their area, this is the timeline. If I have any questions, these are the people that I need to be talking to. So it's really about thinking about how do we make sure it touches upon different aspects of the business and it's not just a standalone project with one person that's responsible for it.
Yeah, and like you said earlier, I mean, reality is that as employees, we are not included in every single decision making, but we have a right to know the why behind the decision making and the decision making process, and that's also contributing to building a culture of transparency.
Yeah.
Michelle, I want to thank you so much for this short conversation, and I do hope that you can stay with us online just for a little bit. If we have, and I can see that we have some questions from the audience, such an important topic, such an important voice that you are, such a massive experience. So it's my invitation to everybody in the audience to contact Michelle and get her advice if pay equity and a pay gap is on your agenda. So Michelle, thank you so much again, and hope to speak to you very soon.
Thank you so much. Thank you.